Dr. Murray, good morning, and thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
See, you're a person that has been loved and hated by many. I count myself among your admirers. To the extent that we're going to talk about some very sensitive things, I'd like to start with a kind of an opening statement about how each of us feels about humans in general. Can you say some words about this?
Sure. I am very strongly of the belief that all human beings have equal human dignity and worth. Human beings can behave in ways which degrade the opinion I have of them, but I absolutely reject the notion that you can take human beings on the basis of their phenotypic qualities of intelligence or personality characteristics, the rest of them, and rate them from superior to inferior. I think that's a deep, profound misunderstanding of what it means to be a human being.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.
I'll just interject here that we used to have, through the Christian tradition, specifically, but more generally the Judeo-Christian tradition, a very easy way of coping with this, that we are all equal in God's eyes. We are all sinners. We all have frailties. And I wish that we could restore that, even for people who are not believers in, specifically in Christianity. Because if you think of it that way, the idea that a God worthy of the name looks at human beings and says, this one is better than that one because of some personality or cognitive characteristic is nuts. The sense that any of us would look at other human being and say, well, that other human being is just like me in terms of their own imperfections. I think it would be much healthier.
Very good. I agree. I will say one thing as well, add another point here, that despite this fundamental equality of humans, much of my own work, and I feel like it's to the extent that I have a mission, my mission for the rest of my working life is going to be to convince people that humans are not absolutely equal, and there are very, very important ways in which we are not equal.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll develop this idea as we proceed, but I'm sure you agree. Obviously, you agree with that. Can you tell me, or can you clarify for anybody listening, that what has motivated you through your work, from a young man at Harvard to post-Harvard to Thailand in general? What has motivated you, or what motivates you today?
Well, it started in Thailand, I think. I spent 6 years there. I went to Thailand in the fall of 1965 in Peace Corps, and I stayed there until 1970, continuously with 1 2-week break. And over the course of that, I had two things that developed in my head. One was I found I loved social science, applied social science. I did in the last 3 years going and worked in the villages and evaluating the impact of social programs. And the one thread there was I was irritated and upset because I would read the anthropological descriptions of Thai villages and how they worked, and I would say to myself, these guys have it wrong, and I understand better how they work. But given the narrative style of anthropological analysis, there was no way to prove it. You know, that you couldn't get your hands on anything that would specify our differences. And so I was drawn very much to quantitative measures of things so that there would be some solid ground on which arguments and opinions could be debated. So that's what drove me back to graduate school, where I've had as my two fields, political development and quantitative methods. Second thing that happened while I was there is in the course of working in Thai villages, I became aware of how different priorities looked from the villagers' point of view and Bangkok's point of view. I was a part of Bangkok's point of view, and we thought entirely in terms of oh, these poor villagers out here, and we have to have these economic and educational and social programs for them to help them. And we went out and implemented those. Usually they didn't work. But then when you talk to villagers about what their priorities were for the government, had nothing to do with those things. The villagers had a couple of very important priorities. One was, as far as the central government was concerned, that they catch water buffalo thieves. I mean, in a Thai village, losing your water buffalo is a big deal. It's a catastrophe. And so they wanted the government to catch those guys. And the second thing they wanted is for the government officials to not come out and arrest them for making enough homemade whiskey for their own consumption. They weren't saying they should sell it, but they said they shouldn't bother us for just making whiskey for them. Mm-hmm. A government which did those two things, as far as they were concerned, was doing the most important stuff. And the other thing was that the real intense interest about local government wasn't about Bangkok. It was about the local headman. And if you had a good headman and good elders in the village was run. If you didn't have one, the village was often very unhappy. So I took that experience back with me to the United States, and it eventually developed into my libertarian beliefs. I did not come to Thailand with those beliefs. I left Thailand with the foundations for those libertarian beliefs.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Go ahead, please.
That's it.
Okay, excellent. And what about, this was you as a young man. At some point, you made a decision to work with a very dear friend of mine, a mutual friend, Richard Herrnstein from Harvard. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to know him and what motivated the bell curve and thereafter?
I first met Richard Herrnstein, Dick, as everybody knew him, in 1984, just as Losing Ground was being published. There was a conference held in New York by the Manhattan Institute, where I was affiliated, with lots of academics coming there to discuss a couple of books, with Losing Ground being one of them. And James Q. Wilson, who I knew, also at Harvard, very eminent political scientist, suggested that Richard Herrnstein should join us because he had a lot of interesting things to say. So I met him then. Subsequently, about 8 years later, in 1989, I had become really interested in IQ. And the reason I become interested, because I pretty much bought into a lot of the criticisms of IQ as a measure, that they were biased, they didn't really mean anything for minorities because of the bias, et cetera, et cetera. And in the mid-1980s, I was sent a couple of technical articles to review, which discussed the relationship of IQ to crime and the relationship of IQ to unemployment. And these were extremely well documented. They were very rigorous analyses, and it was like being shown the dark side of the moon, that all of these things I had believed about IQ were wrong. And so I got the idea I was going to write a book about IQ and social policy. And at the course of that, I read Dick Herrnstein's book, IQ and the Meritocracy. And I can remember reading it and saying to myself, he writes just like I do. Our writing styles were very similar.
This is amazing.
He published an article in The Atlantic then a few months after that involving IQ. And I said to myself, Dick Herrnstein is already working on this book, and I'm not going to try to compete with him. So I called him on the phone and said that I'd been thinking about writing a book, but it looked like he was writing it, and I didn't want to compete with him. And he said, basically, without a moment's hesitation, as I recall, he said, no, I'm not writing a book. Why don't we do it together? And I was kind of stunned. Yeah. And I said, well, let me think about it. And as my memory serves, I think that I called him back later that afternoon and said, yeah, let's do it. That was the sum total of our negotiations. Well, there was one exception.
Wow.
We'd never had any other difficulties at all, except early on, Dick said, I want to do authorship alphabetically, which of course means that Dick would go first. And he told me why. He had co-authored a book called Crime and Human Nature with Jim Wilson. Mm-hmm. And they literally flipped a coin. They gathered one night over drinks with their wives there and so forth. They took a coin and they flipped it to see who would go first. And Dick said, I can't stand to lose another one of those coin flips. And so I said, that's fine. So other than that, that's how we got started. And we worked on the bell curve from the end of 1989, maybe the beginning of 1990. And it was published in the fall of 1994. And it was by far the greatest collaborative intellectual effort I've ever been involved in.
Have you written another book with anybody else? I think that's your only book co-written, right?
No, I've co-written 3 books. Well, the first one was a book published back in the 1970s about juvenile crime. And the fact is that as far as the text is concerned, I wrote it. And I gave co-authorship because I had a really smart research assistant who contributed very importantly to the book. And I just made it co-author. And in retrospect, that was not a fair representation of who wrote the book.
It was your book.
Yeah, and then the other one was with my wife, Catherine Bly-Cox.
Ah, that's right. I forgot that one.
We co-authored Apollo, and that was full.
Okay.
In all 3 of those cases.
Okay. Well, can you give us a little bit of historical background of what was happening during this period? Because this is when I was in college. I entered Harvard in 1985 and met Professor Herrnstein right maybe a few days after freshman orientation. So can you, before I get into how I met him and my involvement with his work, can you describe what's happening in this period during the 80s?
Happening with regard to what specifically? Anything in particular?
The main ideas of the bell curve, for example, the emergence of a cognitive elite, et cetera, et cetera.
Those are the Reagan years, of course. And the main themes in the Reagan years that were getting a lot of attention, if you were on the left, was the greedy Wall Street and the age of greed and so forth. And on the right, it was the golden age to be a conservative / libertarian, because starting in the 1970s, it was on the right where most of the interesting new policy ideas were coming about. Now, this is what was happening in my world in the sense of political activities and public policy activities. And my interest in doing the book on IQ was actually quite independent of all of that. That's the funny thing about it. I had published Losing Ground, which was most directly a critique of the Great Society reforms, both in jurisprudence and in regulations and in legislation. And then I'd written a book called In Pursuit in 1988, which was basically political philosophy, trying to argue for a limited government as a way to foster human flourishing. So those were right in line with the political milieu and the ideological milieu. And this stuff about IQ was out of left field in that regard. It was very simple. I was absolutely fascinated by this stuff. And when I'm fascinated by an intellectual topic, I want to spend all my time looking into it. And the way you do that is by writing a book about it. So taking on this book with IQ kind of mystified the people at the Manhattan Institute. because it wasn't about public policy, really. It was removed from that. And so the answer to your question is, yeah, there were very interesting things going on in the last half of the 1980s, and they had nothing to do with me deciding, gee, I want to write about IQ.
Okay, well, very good. I think from my end, you may or may not find it interesting that, or coincidental, that I met Professor Herrnstein through a protest, not unlike what you've been experiencing recently, specifically at Middlebury College, where you're basically shut down from speaking. No, I was, in fact, I was walking through the yard, and I stumbled upon this protest, and I just out of curiosity asked what it was about, and they were protesting Herrnstein. And I said, well, why are you protesting him? Well, he's a racist and a bigot and a Nazi and all of these things. And I said, what do you mean? How can he be a professor if he's a racist and a bigot and a Nazi? And they said, well, he thinks Mexicans are stupid. I said, what? That's an odd thing. What do you mean Mexicans are stupid? I said, so instead of getting me to distance myself from him, it actually inspired me to get to know him and what was he trying to say. So I thought as an 18-year-old, okay, I'll teach him a thing or two, right? So I took a couple of his courses. In fact, one was with James Q. Wilson and Crime and Human Nature, and the other one on human differences. And little by little, I said, this guy is not a racist, and this guy's work is really, really important. Summing up a long process, because it was difficult to come to terms with this, the fact that groups do differ in intellectual capacity. And this is an important finding. It's so counter or contrary to what's politically acceptable to say and talk about, but this is just a basic fact. The whys are still controversial to some people, but that's not important. The fact is, whether it's nature or nurture, the fact is that we differ in important ways. No, so when I finally understood his syllogism, right, that his important syllogism, that if social success depends to an extent on hereditary, then classes are going to be based on genes. When that finally hit me, I'm sorry, say that again?
To some extent. The syllogism.
To some extent.
Yeah, he said, insofar as success in life is partly dependent on heritable qualities, and insofar as success in life is related to class, then class is going to be to some extent determined by genes. And it's, by the way, the bell curve in a way was an entire explication of that syllogism as it was working out in practice.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, when the strength and the power of his syllogism hit me, I basically dropped everything and went to him and I said, this means that the United States is dead. It's over. It will never work. And this was interesting because this is something that I gather from listening to you over the years, you've come to realize is in fact the case. Am I wrong, or am I exaggerating, or what do you think about that?
Complicated question. I remain absolutely convinced that the founders' initial vision was correct. That yes, the founders had no problem believing that people differed in their abilities. What they said was people had inalienable rights to freedom and the pursuit of happiness, and that these could coexist with each other. And so we could get into a very interesting conversation in which I will take the position there is nothing inherently more satisfying in being a Harvard professor, or for that matter, in being a billionaire, than in being a skilled woodworker, nothing inherently more satisfying in it. And that the whole notion that people have different outcomes in life that are also associated with social class, to me, is not a big deal. Shouldn't be a big deal. But, and here's where you were more right than I was in terms of practice. In practice, what's happened in the United States is that back in the 1930s, we pretty much took all the limits off what was constitutionally permissible. And in the course of, after doing that, you have had a growth of a variety of the administrative state and regulation and things which basically allow the elite to structure society in ways that are congenial to them in a way that they really couldn't do it before. And so what we have now is we do have an upper class that has inspired a great deal of anger and resentment by ordinary Americans for a very good reason. This new elite despises them, holds them in contempt. And yeah, the American experiment as initially envisioned, as far as I'm concerned, is dead. And I would like to think that it could have been averted had we not made some really terrible mistakes in constitutional jurisprudence back in the 1930s, but maybe not. Maybe the whole experiment in having a free society in which people pursued their own happiness in ways that they found satisfying and people respected each other across classes, maybe that was just one moment in history when that was possible. But I will say, Louis, one of the saddest things that's happened in my lifetime is that when I was a boy, it was true that to look down on anyone else because you were smarter or richer than they were was un-American. I'm not saying all Americans lived by that principle, that ideal. They certainly didn't do it with regard to racial differences, but it was, you were a snob if you looked down on somebody, and you weren't supposed to do that. On the contrary, it was the ordinary American who was the backbone of the country. That's been, as far as I can tell, entirely lost among the elites. So you turned out to be right. I wish I had been, but you did.
Well, this is interesting because I went to, the day I went to Professor Ernstein and told him this or asked him this, I said, what can we do about this, right? Which has largely been, I think, I gather, a question that has motivated a lot of your work. What can we do about this? How do we create societies where we can make people happy? And so I went to Professor Ernstein and I said, this is like very serious. This is, what can we do about it? And he said, nobody knows. Nobody knows was his answer. And that for me was a key moment in my life. So ever since then, I've been obsessed about this question. I suppose much like you and many others, no? What can we do about it? And I think coming to terms with the fact that people are different is fundamentally important. This idea that everybody is equal is really damaging. I think in fact, what you write about, the rise of the cognitive elite, is one of the biggest problems I had when I got to Harvard. I could smell it, not because I was treated differently. To the contrary, I was treated like royalty as far as I was concerned. I lived in a nice, popular house. I got invited into the finals clubs, et cetera, et cetera. But when I asked people what motivated them, it was always something personal. It was always something, what motivates me is either fame or fortune or some kind of, you could feel it and I think this is what's happening now, not just in the US, but on a global scale. Mm-hmm. The US is just a small experiment of what's taking place at a faster, more accelerated rate around the world. So this is why I on the one hand, I share your pessimism. In fact, I'm more pessimistic about the possibilities of human flourishing, or how to create governments that allow people to flourish. On the other hand, I'm more optimistic about the prospects. But if you will allow me, I'd like to talk about some of the shortcomings that I see in your proposals. Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely.
For example, universal basic income. Can you first give us a quick argument about why you think universal basic income will work?
Sure. This came about, we started thinking about universal basic income back in the 1980s, when it's apparent to me that government attempts to help the poor are riven with terrible problems, and they don't actually accomplish much, and that the nation was getting richer and richer, and the best thing you could do if you wanted to get rid of poverty was to give people the money. But when I started thinking about this in the 1980s, I ran the numbers, and we simply didn't have enough wealth in the country to pull it off. By the early 2000s, it was clear that we would have sufficient wealth to provide a basic income to everyone, and it would be cheaper than the very expensive system that we put in place. How would it work? The absolutely crucial condition is that it replaces everything else. So no more food stamps, no more Medicare and Medicaid, for that matter, no more Social Security, no more of all the other kinds of social programs. All of that's replaced. So instead, each person age 21 and over gets a monthly deposit to an electronic deposit to a known bank account. And the amount of money that I have used, depending on the year, has been, I think, $10,000 initially. And now I've raised it to about 12. And because of inflation and so forth. Here's the basic logic. Point number one, it enables people who got the short end of the stick in the genetic lottery to have actually a comfortable style of life. It's within their grasp. Let's say it's $10,000. Let's put aside medical care. That's a complicated issue. Let's say medical care has been dealt with otherwise. You have $10,000. Well, that's not enough to live on comfortably. But suppose you can convince somebody else to share. Well, that's $20,000 for two people, okay? And of course, the best way to convince somebody else to share is to marry that person. It's now suppose you're both working at minimum wage jobs. Minimum wage. I won't try to do the numbers in my head as I talk, but essentially, if you both work at minimum wage jobs, plus you have the $20,000 of basic income, you're talking about somewhere in the $40,000 range of disposable income. You aren't rich, but together you can make a quite decent, well above privation lifestyle for yourselves. And that's accessible to everybody if they cooperate with other human beings. If they want to live by themselves in isolation, that 10 grand is not going to provide them with a very good life, but they have it within their capacity. The other reason why I'm in favor of this is because point number one, there will be income redistribution no matter what. Libertarians who dream of a world without income redistribution by the government are crazy. It's going to happen. We're just too rich for it not to happen. If it's going to happen, and you use a universal basic income instead of government assistance, it could revitalize civil society. Here's the logic. You're going to have people who are still alcoholics, who are lazy, who are self-destructive or whatever, and they will, let's say they're alcoholics and they drink up all their money before the end of the month. Well, what are they going to do? They can't go to the government. They're going to have to go to a spouse, a parent, a child, a neighbor, friends, the Salvation Army, and they're going to have to ask for help. The difference is that they are no longer helpless victims. So that if they go to a brother, the brother can say to them, okay, we aren't going to let you starve, but we know that you've got a check coming into your account 2 weeks from now. And don't tell us there's nothing you can do about it. There is something you can do about it. It's time you got your act together. the universal basic income gives people with problems a moral agency that they can deny now, or that they don't believe they have now. They legitimately say, there's nothing I can do. And the universal basic income says to them, actually, there is something you can do. And I would like to think that can revitalize a lot of social networks that now are moribund. I'd like to think it can revitalize human relationships. Now, Luis, if you say to me, I don't know what your other criticisms are going to be, but I will tell you the one that I will completely agree with. It's never going to work that way. If you do a universal basic income, it will never happen that it replaces everything else. It will be an add-on to a very elaborate government system, and my logic breaks down. Okay, so that's the idea.
Okay, no, I'm going to assume that it's possible. I'm going to assume that it's possible. So I don't necessarily agree with the idea that nothing is possible. I think it's possible if you get enough will behind it and the right people behind it. I think things are possible. I don't think that's the problem that I have with it. The problem that I have with it is based on your own logic in the bell curve and in human diversity, in the fact that the more you eliminate barriers to social justice and equality, the more we inevitably polarize. Mm-hmm. So what you will do is those few people that are left in the US who really can't get ahead because they are limited for income or for opportunities, the more we fix and give them these opportunities, there's no mechanism that guarantees that we're going to be more cohesive or that the world will be more cohesive. In fact, there's abundant empirical evidence to demonstrate that we are actually polarizing more and more. So I don't see a mechanism whereby universal basic income will bring society into a center. So there's two vectors that are going in opposite directions. I don't see universal basic income. I don't see the force that brings those two vectors back into the center. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I guess that my reaction is, if you are saying that that we've got a problem with assortative mating and other things which are creating more and more differences, I will agree with that. But I also live, as I have lived for 30 years, in a small town in Maryland that in farming territory and working class, and I've got to tell you that traditional American communities are still out there in abundance. You get out of the major metropolitan areas, and it's just like Alexis de Tocqueville described in terms of the kinds of community interactions that go on. And so if you take my small town as an example, we have people within that town who have problems and who see themselves as victims. And already within the town, you have the same kind of social interactions I'm describing, with people saying to them, come on, we'll help you out, but you've got to get on your feet. and here's the thing. Herrnstein's syllogism is correct. And it means that with certain kinds of super talented people, they are tending to be isolated in certain sectors of society. But you know what? You don't have to have an IQ of 135 to be a completely functioning, competent human being. And so the distribution of IQs in the ordinary American's small town there's plenty of human capital there to make civil society work. And in this case, I would say, look, I'm not going to do anything with the universal basic income to get the people who are isolated in Greenwich, Connecticut, in their mansions to interact with the rest of America. That won't happen. But what the universal basic income will do will make it much easier for the very widespread potential for functioning civil society to be more effective.
Well, I have to agree with you. And I think universal basic income eventually is inevitable. I don't see a way around it. I think it's inevitable with the coming artificial intelligence and coming technology. I think it's eventually going to happen. However, there's another difficulty here, and I wanted to ask you about it. Pretty soon, we don't know exactly when, but pretty soon, in fact, it's already happening to an extent, we're going to have the ability to, or the super talented and super people with a lot of resources have the ability to genetically alter their children. So I don't see the super talented saying, listen, we need to close the genetic gap. As a matter of fact, I see them doubling and tripling that gap. And this is another reason I think that UBI is, even if we could eliminate government, implement UBI, that other technological genetic engineering is spells doom for UBI. Am I wrong? Do you agree?
Well, you're not necessarily correct that the elites will double down in terms of their own behavior without being interested in helping anybody else. And in fact, the rich of the country, in many ways, the UBI will be a way for the rich to get rid of some of their guilt, I would imagine. So I don't see economically why that's going to interfere. What you have raised is something that goes way beyond the UBI or any other specific policy proposal, and that is the capacity to alter the genome in ways that affects traits. Boy, there are so many ways that could go wrong. And the other essential, inescapable statement is that it will happen. The idea that governments can prevent this is pipe dream, because even if the United States and the EU says, no, we don't want people doing that, China isn't going to be that way.
Exactly.
And this genie cannot be shoved back in the bottle.
I agree with you.
I think it's really important, spade work at this point, to get people, and especially the elites, to come to grips with how incredibly lucky they are, and inspire in them the humility that is appropriate. I mean, the fact is, we do not choose our parents. We won the genetic lottery. We meaning you and I, that both went to Harvard as kids. And if you got into Harvard, you're probably pretty smart. I'd like to take credit for some of my qualities. I'd like to think that our self-discipline and persistence and that kind of thing, I do better than I need to have done. I'm under no illusions that I made myself smart in any way, shape, or form. Neither did you.
Absolutely.
And this is what the elites don't have now that they used to have, to some degree. It used to be the case that if you went to Princeton or Harvard or Yale 100 years ago, yes, were you going to a socioeconomically elite group? That's correct. But you were also in a university which saw as one of its missions to teach you a sense of responsibility and obligation to be worthy of your good luck. In this case, they were thinking about socioeconomic good luck. Well, we need to make the elites of this world understand how humble they should feel, because they have been given such a great gift through no effort on their own part. So in a way, if you want to ask what I'm trying to do with human diversity in the last chapter, it's precisely that. Well, it's actually what Dick Ernstein and I tried to do in the last chapter of the bell curve, and it's what I tried to do in the last chapter of Coming Apart. You asked what's motivated me earlier on in the podcast. For the last since the bell curve came out, a lot of what's motivated me is to try to get this point across.
Absolutely, I think it's so important, so vital. I can't stress that enough. And I'm humbled. I'm humbled by the work and the sacrifice that you've done to get that message across. And it's unfortunate that so few of the people in the right positions are receiving it. We can't even talk about this in public, and that's really, really unfortunate. And it's primarily the elites, like you've said, it's the elites, because every person that goes to Harvard knows instinctively that they did not do anything for their intelligence. There's some that
I
believe
hope
that they
they
were.
know that. I hope they know that.
Yeah, I hope they know that too. Yeah, but there are some that argue that they worked really hard. And I suppose if you got to Harvard by working really, really, really hard, I suppose that can be excused. No, but I think the vast majority of people that get into Harvard these days are people that work hard no matter where they go.
Yeah,
No, so I
yeah.
think. Um, well, thank you very much for your time. I did promise you that I would suggest a libertarian, what I believe is a libertarian solution to this, and I'll very quickly mention it just to ask some food for thought. And if I'm lucky and sometime in the future we can talk again. I'm sorry we didn't talk about human diversity. You just got so much interesting material. And your latest book, Human Diversity, all of your books are just so wonderful. In Pursuit is a wonderful book as well. What's missing in Pursuit, if I might add, is the mechanism by which to arrive there.
Yeah, well, as you're aware, I say I'm a libertarian, and libertarians don't do solutions. That is one of the defects of that political philosophy.
Well, allow me to suggest something very quickly, Dr. Murray. What I've been pushing for is that what we need to do is push beyond the concept of equality and allow the political processes to be governed by market forces. What we do is compete in the political arena to see who's willing to invest more in human flourishing and give those who are willing to invest more in the common good more authority in public decisions. If you think about it, the last arena where there's still vestiges of communism, it's in the concept of equality, that everybody has to have one vote. This is a communist notion, not directly communist, but there's a parallel to communism in that everybody's equal. If we compete, and we compete specifically to find out who's willing to invest the more in society, we'll get precisely the kinds of people that you talk about in Pursuit, the kinds that don't want to tell other people what to do, the kinds of people that are interested in human flourishing. They'll have a disproportionate impact on social policy. And then these little platoons that you talk about so convincingly in your books and in Pursuit specifically, this will allow it. So this is a specific, concrete, doable mechanism that will...
But how would you identify these people?
Voluntary taxes. Voluntary taxes. And you make it proportional so that the rich don't... Actually, the rich are completely disadvantaged because it's proportional. So that if Bill Gates gives 10 billion, but that represents 10% of his income, but I give 50% of my income, I have more authority in public policy than Bill Gates. So if you establish...
How do you keep the people from using that as a way to gain governmental power? As opposed...
No, that's what you want. No, you don't want to keep them. You want them to have governmental power. And what keeps the wrong people from it is the competitive mechanism. In competition, any competition, there's always going to be winners and losers. If you want to compete in the game of political power, you're going to have to give 90, 95, 100% of your work product. If you don't give that much, you'll be not very powerful in that sense. So the people with the most amount of authority will be the ones who give the most.
And I will worry about the prospect of people doing that, precisely saying to themselves, once I get into a position of greater authority, I can make back this money 10 times over by all the ways in which people historically have used the government for their own enrichment.
That's true, but keep in mind that it's competition. Keep in mind that it would be illegal, more illegal than it is now. It would be illegal. And we have the technology to really fight against that. And I like Nozick's concept of imagine a utopia. Uh-huh. So people that wanted to be rich under this system, okay, that's fine. You want to be rich and create your own system? Fine. Go ahead and go and create your society, and let's see how well your society does.
Well, it's a very interesting idea. I'm not going to. We don't have time to talk about it any length, but it's an interesting thought experiment to conduct, and as you know, even with plans that are difficult to implement, there's nothing I enjoy more than a good thought experiment.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Murray. I sincerely appreciate it.
I've enjoyed the conversation.
Okay.